Hi everyone, I'm Mike Bird, and I'm going to give you a summary of what happened in this week gone by when it came to gender, the Bible, and evangelicalism, at least as I experienced it online. The first thing we have to talk about is Legate. What do I mean by that? Well, according to Owen Strachan, America's leading complementarian theologian, there is a pandemic going on. I'm not talking about COVID. I'm not talking about Starbucks offering pumpkin spice lattes long after Christmas has ended. No, the pandemic I'm talking about is none other than women wearing leggings. These tight-fitting clothing that have basically two purposes: to entice men to lust and to compel women to do yoga. And as we all know, doing yoga leads to other things like becoming vegan, and vegan leads to things like environmental ethics, and environmental ethics lead to things like voting Democrat. But let me assure you, Owen is going to put you all straight, and he will talk at length for an entire hour about the dangers and the evils of women wearing leggings and why you should avoid them at all costs. I'm going to do my own little response to that rant by Owen. I don't really understand what he's concerned about. What I see here, though, is primarily a concern and effort to control women by what they wear. That's what it comes down to. It's another instance of the patriarchy telling women what is and is what not appropriate, and it never seems to apply to men, though, does it? We don't have a problem with men walking around bare-chested, even if that does arouse certain feelings of desire in our sisters. But that's enough for now. Legate, you have been warned. But secondly, I want to share with you a whole bunch of publishing news. First of all, Beth Moore, Madam Beth Moore, otherwise known as the mother I secretly always wanted. Beth Moore is bringing out her own memoir soon called All My Knotted Up Life. This is going to be one of the gifts I give to my wife, but it's secretly for me. Like that chainsaw I brought her last year, or that complete collection of the commentaries of Cyril of Alexandria in Syriac. I give it to my wife, but it's secretly for me. That will be coming out. You will want to get that one. That, no doubt, will be a great story about the life, the ministry, the struggles of Beth Moore, a wonderful Christian lady, I'm told, and from what I know about her through social media. But other publishing news, Professor Beth Allison Barr of Baylor University is bringing out a couple of books. She signed a 2-book deal with Brazos. One is called Becoming the Pastor's Wife, and the other one is called Losing Our Medieval Religion. I'll be looking out for them as well. I'll be particularly waiting very earnestly for the endorsements from Kevin DeYoung and possibly Al Mohler as well. It'll be interesting to see who they get to endorse those 2 books. That sounds like it's going to be exciting. I should add on the publishing front as well that my good friend Amy Bird, her book, The Sexual Reformation, has come out, and if you sign up, you get to listen to some really good interviews and discussions that Amy Bird does with people like myself, doing a Sopranos impersonation, but also people like Nijay Gupta, Beth Allison Barr, Tiffany Bloom, and others. So you don't want to miss out on that. That is a really good event. There's some really good interviews you want to listen to, even if you don't end up with the book. But let me now get to the main event. I want to look at some reviews of the arch feminista herself, Professor Kristen DuMay. She has elicited a number of reviews that I've either just come across or have come out recently. Now, one of these is by a Christian laywoman writing for The Federalist, Rebecca Curtis, who is deeply offended or unsettled by Professor DuMay's book, Jesus and John Wayne, because she considers it not just a critique of certain aspects or attributes of American evangelicalism. She considers it an attack on evangelicalism itself, as if Professor DuMay is saying that evangelicalism is itself intrinsically evil and is an existential threat to all human beings in America. Mrs. Curtis is worried exactly about that. That it's simply a really die-hard, dogged critique of the very idea of evangelicalism. Mrs. Curtis also says, look, on the one hand, there are some downsides to being in bed with the Republican Party, but on the other hand, look at the plus sides. We're in a culture war. There is some real sexual deviancy going on, and now look what we've got on the Supreme Court. We've got Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch. We've got Amy Coney Barrett. Things are looking up, so maybe getting into bed with the GOP, dirty, dark, and damp as it was, maybe it's worth it because of the Supreme Court. To which I would say, well, yeah, getting a few Supreme Court justices is okay. And hey, look, I'm more than willing to acknowledge good things that the Trump government does. I like to take a fairly independent, even-handed evaluation of the Biden and Trump administrations. I'm fairly centrist and moderate in my politics. But let's also consider the downside to the marriage with the GOP. You get a lot of American politicians really feigning their religion, their faith. People like Matt Gaetz, who quite frankly does for the kingdom of God what Hannibal Lecter does for vegetarianism, if you ask me. And consider some other things. Yes, you got some Supreme Court justices, but cast your mind back to, a certain day in January 6. Now, I know you Americans love your revolutions against rightfully installed divine government, a la Romans 13, but even granting that, the one thing you've got to remember about launching a coup is that it's only treason if you lose. And the Trump supporters lost, so it was treason. I mean, Trump tried to overturn the election, so what's the point? Saying, yeah, we got some Supreme Court justices if your democracy dies in a fascist coup. Is that really, really worth it? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. The other thing Mrs. Curtis says is that evangelicals in America feel kind of hunted. They are a persecuted group. And this feeds into a certain type of persecution complex. Now, let me say a couple of things to that. I know enough of progressive tribes to say that there are some that really do have it out for you. Okay, they really do have it. They are out to get you because they consider historic Orthodox Christianity the number one thing they're up against. Now, hey, I live in the state of Victoria, okay, in Melbourne, or as I like to call it, Melbourne grad. Victoria is so progressive, it makes Massachusetts look like Alabama in comparison. We've had some really heavy government. We've had some really heavy mask mandates. And if you knew about some of the laws in Victoria, you would notice that our government is not inclined towards religious freedom. So yeah, I get it. Actually, my latest book just came out, Religious Freedom in a Secular Age, where I'm trying to argue that secularism is a good thing to protect us from predatory and punitive government. So I get it. But here's what you've got to remember. Not every progressive critique of evangelicalism is necessarily rooted in a kind of I'm just out to get you. Some of the progressive critiques of Christianity, particularly when it comes to things such as race and patriarchy, I think might actually be valid. And remember, all truth is God's truth, whether it's on the lips of Donald Trump or the lips of the devil or whoever it is. There is some truth to progressive critiques. And you've only got to see some of the really weird outrage that evangelicals in America have over things like CRT. Or go back to the 1980s and look at evangelicals and how they responded to things like the Equal Rights Act. I mean, you can really see that there is some ugly stuff when it comes to race and gender in evangelicalism. And sadly, that is often being one of the galvanizing forces. You have to remember that what brought evangelicals together in many cases was, Roe versus Wade, the abortion issue. And let me say, I am, in a qualified sense pro-life, or I should say in a more thorough sense I'm pro-life, because it applies to other things as well. But there was also a lot of Christian leaders who were brought together on things like being pro-segregation. Remember the Falwells, they were very pro-segregation. They were very pro-South African apartheid, back in the day of the 70s and even into the 1980s. So I think Mrs. Curtis's critique of Professor DuMay's book shows precisely what the differences are in American evangelicalism or American Protestantism. And I don't think it's just a progressive versus a conservative divide. I think it also pertains to different understandings of what Christianity is and how Christianity is to respond to a culture that might be post-Christian or even anti-Christian in points. I don't think Professor DuMay is merely a blunt instrument for the progressive side of politics. I think that's a distortion of what her project is. She's providing, I think, a very wise and chastened critique of certain aspects of American evangelicalism. Which brings me to the other review of Professor DuMay's book I want to look at, and that comes from Australia. That comes from the Gospel Coalition Australia. If you don't know, a lot of countries have their own gospel coalition, and they are independent of the American Gospel Coalition. So they're kind of like friends, but it's its own independent entity. And there is a chap called Al Stewart. He's a former Anglican bishop of Melbourne. Now he's a leader in a fellowship of independent evangelical churches, where he works with various church planners and encourages them. And he's written his own review of Professor DuMay's book. And it's interesting because this is someone who is a very solid complementarian, a very thorough complementarian, very reformed in their theology, but not necessarily in the American sense. And his review of the book is very interesting. And the things he takes away from the book are things like this, recognizing that American evangelicalism is a cultural and political movement. It's not pure religion isolated from political happenings. No, it's definitely a cultural and political movement. And also, Al Stewart commends the book for being well written and well researched. He does have a few criticisms, a few finicky things he finds wrong with the book, which some of these I find are, a little bit odd. He says, well, there's no Bible mentioned in the book. Well, again, this is a sort of a history or a cultural commentary. It's not an exegesis of 1 Timothy 2, so I think his expectations were a bit wrong. He says, yeah, the book sounds very progressive, but, Al acknowledges that pretty much most people in the world are more progressive than he is, so that's not too hard. He also says he makes the mistake, he thinks Professor DuMay makes the mistake of viewing everything through the lens of race and patriarchy. Look, I think in American political discourse, and even in Australia, that can be true. Everything is viewed through the lens of race and patriarchy. Everything comes down to oppressor and oppressor. Be that as it may, race and patriarchy have been the big things that have brought people together in American evangelicalism, that have been the rallying points, whether that was pro-segregationists or whether it was response to the Equal Rights Act, whether it's the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Those are the things that have galvanized various networks and a lot of the big organizations, whether we're talking about, the Gospel Coalition, which is basically Calvinism or complementarianism, or, James Dobson's network, they have played heavily on a kind of Christian type of patriarchy. So I don't think you can really fault Professor DuMay for focusing on race and gender when those have been the issues, those have been the topics that have really elicited responses from American Christians, American conservative Christians within the evangelical tribe. It's not that Kristen DuMay is imposing it. It's that this is what is emerging, and she's just noticing it. But Al Stewart does compliment Professor DuMay on a number of things, and he has a number of good things to take away. He says, I kind of love my American friends, but he says in reading this book, it means we've got to be very careful about what we import directly from the United States. We've got to be careful about that. I think that's a good point to take away. I love my American friends. I would love if they set up a Chick-fil-A franchise in Australia, but there's some stuff in America I feel like, yeah, you can definitely keep that. And I'm not just talking about the pumpkin spice lattes. There's a whole bunch of other stuff they need to keep that. The other thing Al Stewart takes away from reading Professor DuMay's book is that he says we've got to be careful how we teach about gender in our context. In other words, he's saying you need sensitivity and you need nuance, okay? And his main appropriation for the book is he's not going to give up his complementarianism. He's very clear on that. He's pretty much a die-hard complementarianism. If you know anything about Sydney Anglicans, they do tend to be strong complementarians, although there is a diversity amongst them, to be honest. But he still has an appreciation for the book, okay? So I think Al Stewart's a good example of someone who recognizes the good of the book by Professor DuMay. He's not going to give up his deeply held beliefs about marriage, family, and the role of women in the church, but he genuinely learned something, okay? He is now a little bit more cautious about stuff he imports from America. He wants to be more sensitive and nuanced in how he talks about women's roles, gender, sex, patriarchy, that type of thing in his own context. And he shows, you don't have to give up your whole complementarian beliefs, but you can definitely learn things that are constructive and helpful. So those are two, I think, contrasting critiques between Rebecca Curtis and Al Stewart when it comes to reading about Professor DuMay's book. But that's pretty much all I have for you. Things you should take away. Remember, no leggings. There are some good books you should maybe be pre-ordering on Amazon or wherever you get their books when they come out, and a couple of different reviews of Jesus and John Wayne, quite a juxtaposition of different ways of responding to this book, probably indicative of the different ways that American and Australian evangelicals are going to critique books and their own culture in terms of where they are. And that's all I have for you. Hope you enjoyed. Who knows, maybe I'll do another one of these gender war roundups in the future. Otherwise, have a good weekend, and that's all from me.